Using a typewriter. Using a typewriter, you write, you don't like it, you take it out, you crumple up the paper and throw it in the waste paper basket. Pastimes of early youth have stayed with me all my life. Chess and table tennis. I counted on chess to keep me alert and sharp, but table tennis is better.
Hello, everybody. I'm Tina Brown, and I'm happy to welcome you tonight. It's wonderful that the Society of Editors and the London Press Club are hosting tonight's event as a tribute to Harry. He would be thrilled to know that the room full of brilliant journalists and writers are gathered in his name. No one loved being celebrated more than Harry did. Just as traces of ink were a permanent part of his fingerprint, his years as a British newspaper man never left him. Even talking about those days gave him a visceral joy. In one of my favorite passages in his memoir, My Paper Chase, he wrote, "Did I mention how invigorating it was to have a big-time national newspaper with the best staff in town? I still get a high from the fumes of those Saturdays when a vague idea from the beginning of the week or an investigation started months back crystallized into a thriller package of a story, headline, photographer, and graphic, and then the glorious moment when we got our hands on the first copies of the newspaper." Harry's years as editor, first of the Northern Echo and then the Sunday Times, took place during what he called the steam age of newspapers. But in the many decades and platforms since, Harry was unwavering in his pursuit of truth, and not the least disrupted by the digital age. I can attest that he was banging out his op-eds, interviewing politicians and generals for Reuters, blasting purveyors of disinformation, and tweeting away until just weeks before he died last September. What made him so unique as an editor was his deep human curiosity, his remarkable tenacity, and a moral seriousness that was the opposite of pious. He knew that the subjects of journalism are timeless. Lying politicians, weaselly lawyers, equivocating corporations, and so-called voiceless people. That euphemism for people who, of course, are not voiceless at all. Their voices are simply not being heard. They spurred him on, and he never forgot them. Even decades after his 10-year campaign to get compensation for the thalidomide victims, he always made time to see them when he was in London or they visited New York. Our dear friend historian Simon Sharma said, "I knew Harry was a hero, dauntless, inimitable, scourge of the idle, the second-rate, and the over-entitled. Harry knew that knowledge as well as footwork wasn't the enemy of great journalism, but the condition of it. It's as good a mandate as I've heard for journalism, and I know that Harry would have agreed. He would have been so delighted that a great practitioner like Clive Myrie, fresh off his win as TV Journalist of the Year and Network Presenter of the Year, will speak to you tonight about how to keep that light of truth alive." For a proper introduction to Clive, I turn things over to Helen Bowden, who's left her own indelible imprint on British journalism as former director of BBC News and BBC Radio. And I thank all of you for honoring Harry in such a meaningful way.
Thank you, Tina. And welcome to all of you to this lecture sponsored by the Society of Editors to the memory of Sir Harold Evans. You've heard from Tina, a wonderful journalist in her own right, and soon you'll be hearing from Clive Myrie, our lecturer, a distinguished BBC practitioner. He, like Harold, spent years in the USA and views its media ecosystem with a mixture of fascination and alarm. He'll explain why in his lecture. Clive has been a television reporter and presenter for over 30 years. He joined the BBC's graduate training scheme. He's got a law degree from Sussex University, and like Harold, cut his teeth on local and regional news. In 1996, he became a foreign correspondent and has reported from more than 80 countries. He's covered a depressing number of natural disasters, catastrophes, and conflicts, including being embedded with the Royal Marines during the 2003 invasion of Iraq. More recently, you will have seen him on the big BBC One news bulletins at 6 and 10, and reporting from the hospital front line during the pandemic. It's a tremendous accolade to his range, his skill, and his experience that, as Tina just mentioned, he won not one, but 2 awards at this year's RTS Journalism Awards. He was named Network Presenter of the Year and Television Journalist of the Year. And here's just a taste of why the judges decided this was a man really at the top of his game.
In our culture, as a Navajo, as a Native American, it's something we're not supposed to even do, to deal with death.
But dealing with death is Michael Begay's calling in the worst corner of the worst country for COVID-19.
Yeah, with COVID patients, we normally don't embalm. We usually just keep them in the body bag.
An undertaker, he prepares bodies for burial on the Navajo lands of northern Arizona.
The numbers are going up again, so we are preparing for another influx of bodies.
Living in the largest of the Native American territories, the Navajo have suffered more coronavirus deaths per head of population than any of the 50 states of the Union. Many hundreds of people.
There was that point when I went into our storage unit, and I just saw all those bodies laying there, and I knew 2 of them. It was a hard time for me, you know, knowing that those people are laying there, and people that I've known, and they're here because of COVID. It was heartbreaking. And a good friend of mine, his son died of COVID. And I've known him since he was a little boy. And I got the phone call, and I was talking to him on the phone, and I just told him, I said, well, I can't imagine what you're going through. You know, I've known him since he was a child, and we both cried on the phone together.
Americans say their land is blessed by God. Now it's cursed by COVID-19. And there's seemingly no clear strategy to end its hold on the land. Navajo Nation is one of the poorest parts of America, and mask mandates and curfews were introduced early in the pandemic. But the virus had already taken hold, and with few healthcare facilities, many were left at COVID's mercy. But that's the American story, that despite its untold riches, millions always struggle. This is Tent City in Phoenix. Thousands homeless, some losing their jobs due to the pandemic, and now losing their lives.
This pandemic is instant death. Yeah.
Meet James Wright. He's 62.
People dying here in the camp.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, every day.
Pity would be no more if we didn't make somebody poor.
They got a big-ass medical center right there. But when you got COVID-19 so bad and nothing can help you, it's death, man. You have a good day.
Social distancing is tough in Tent City. It's tough here too, at this Trump rally. But why? We scrupulously kept our distance and wore masks at this gathering in Tucson. But in this deeply polarized country, wearing or not wearing a face covering has become a political statement. This is Chris and his family.
So, do you enjoy the atmosphere at the rally yesterday?
We did.
But the pandemic is still out there. That didn't worry you, being with all those people yesterday?
No. It didn't bother me one bit.
If Donald Trump said everyone should wear a mask, he's following the science, you would do it?
Reluctantly, I would, probably.
Do you think it's un-American to be forced to wear a mask?
I do. I think it's un-American to force anybody to do something that there's no medical reason. If you're not sick.
There has been a conflict in all of us during this time, and perhaps more so here in the land of the free. Individualism versus collective responsibility.
It's part of our culture to take care of one another. It's always the natives that are wearing masks. And you see that, and a lot of non-natives are not that diligent, but we as a people are.
So this is really the start of COVID. We opened this area here.
In Navajo Nation, they had to build a new cemetery to take all the dead.
And this is one of your close friends?
Yeah. COVID is why he's laying here. You know, and I just think it shouldn't have happened.
The presidential election is above all a referendum on Donald Trump's handling of the coronavirus pandemic. Whoever wins must guide this country out of the darkness to a better shore reachable from here. Clive Myrie, BBC News in Navajo Nation, northern Arizona.
Wow, that all seems such a long time ago. It was only last year. Helen, thank you. And thank you, Tina. And thanks to the London Press Club and the Society of Editors for inviting me to speak today. I'd like to begin with who, what, where, when, and why. 5 questions that are part of our trade. Answer those questions in relation to any news story. We're doing our jobs as journalists. They underpin everything we do. What we write in a newspaper or online, what we say on TV or on the radio. It feels to me, however, that one of those questions we sometimes need to ask of ourselves. Why? It doesn't have to be every day or all the time, but given the power we have, it's important. What is the point of the media in a democracy? What are we here for? We can influence massive societal changes. Indirectly, we even wield political power, able to influence policy, perhaps even able to change governments. And with power, as we're all well aware, comes great responsibility. Now, Sir Harold Evans understood this down to the marrow in his bones, and he chose throughout his storied career to leverage that power for the greater good of society. But who should police this? Is it enough to let the industry itself be the gatekeeper of how far a broadcaster or newspaper should go in trying to make a profit or build an audience? Or are independent regulators the only way to ensure media companies use the power they have wisely? I'm going to focus on the broadcasting sector in this speech, and specifically television, and contrast the situation here in the UK, where there is a robust and for some choking regulatory framework, with the United States, where oversight in one crucial respect is non-existent: the requirement to fairly represent the views of opposing sides in news and current affairs broadcasts. Could that lack of a check on how America does news actually imperil democracy itself? In 2009, James Murdoch, then a senior executive at News Corporation, which owns Fox News in America, though he wasn't at the time responsible for the channel, He gave a speech at the Edinburgh Television Festival. Now, his McTaggart lecture made it clear what he believed the role of the media was in a democracy. Making money was the starting point from which everything else flowed. All the good benign stuff, creativity, public trust, and news coverage that was truly independent and challenged the consensus. His exact words were, "The only reliable, durable, and perpetual guarantor of independence is profit." It follows then, and James Murdoch agreed, that the only regulator should be the market. If the public doesn't like your product, it will go someplace else. It's the public that will keep you on the straight and narrow. There is no need for a regulator invested with powers by statute. Now, Harry Evans didn't agree with statutory regulation, in his case for newspapers. As he told Steve Hewlett in an edition of the BBC Radio 4 programme, The Media Show, when you start writing the law between the sentences, between the commas, a whole scandal may escape because of a well-meaning intent to protect somebody or someone's interest. But Harry Evans did firmly believe in powerful independent regulation with teeth, even though it wasn't backed by statute, because maintaining public trust in the press was vital. He called for press regulation that was tough and that went beyond what many in Fleet Street wanted. After the Leveson inquiry into press standards, he supported proposals for a regulator that would wholly be independent of commercial interests and the publishers of newspapers. It must be committed only to enhancing the standards of the British press, he said, and restoring public confidence. It is a necessary condition of the freedom of the press to act in the public interest. Sir Harold Evans and I are both northerners from working class roots. We were both born on the right side of the Pennines in Greater Manchester, not far from each other. He is a son of Eccles, I'm from Bolton. He's a man I never met, but I knew him anyway. I had a paper round at the age of 12, and looking back on those days, I always cite the work of Sir Trevor MacDonald or Alan Wicker as being instrumental in convincing me journalism was my trade. But on reflection, devouring my free copies of the Sunday Times at a young age was influential too. Every week, the uncovering of the truth when encrusted with lies, a belief in decency and honesty. They're all things I recognized in the work of that paper. I, of course, in my very early teens had no idea who the editor was, but it was Harry. My love of America mirrors his, its endless possibilities. In the 1990s, I was the BBC West Coast correspondent based in Los Angeles, but I frequently made trips to Washington for bureau cover. I will never forget the first time I went inside the White House. I was in awe to be at the heart of global power. I later spent quite a lot of time at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue as full-time BBC Washington correspondent while George W. Bush was in residence. I've covered every presidential election since 1996, including Joe Biden's recent victory, and I've reported on many a midterm election in between. The fact that the richest democracy on the planet cannot quite get it right and promote the interests of all its citizens is what's endlessly fascinating about America. The gap between its ideals and reality. A place rightly proud of its democratic traditions, yet where today votes are suppressed and gerrymandering is rife. According to the latest Freedom in the World report, America is outside the top 50 countries for tackling political corruption and conflicts of interest. Then there's the racism. Poverty is endemic, and a fifth of all adults are illiterate or semi-illiterate. Yet it's the country of Silicon Valley and the internet, of democratic ideals and dreamers and astronauts, of tens of millions convinced they can secure their American dream, and tens of millions who believe they already have. But to see up close last year the country brought so low by a beyond cynical politics in an ultra-toxic media environment was truly heartbreaking. The land of Edward R. Murrow and Cronkite, Woodward and Bernstein, and the Pentagon Papers reduced to this.
Good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson Tonight. Happy Thursday. So why are the Democrats so angry? We've asked that question a number of times. It doesn't seem to make any sense, truly. In November, the Democratic Party won everything, full control of the federal government. They seethed for years while they were out of power. That made sense. But winning seemed to enrage them even more. Did you watch Democrats on television today at the impeachment hearings? They are crazy person mad, florid-faced, irrational, yelling and making threats. It is bizarre. You'd think they get to work fixing the country they inherited. They promised to do that. Instead, they set about breaking things and hurting people. What is going on here? Well, maybe it's intrinsic. There's a certain sort of low-character person who becomes more vicious in victory. Power makes them mean.
That is the president of the United States. That is the most powerful person in the world. And we see him like an obese turtle on his back, flailing in the hot sun, realizing his time is over.
Harmless banter, maybe, except Tucker Carlson and Anderson Cooper are among the most popular television news hosts in America. Between them, they garner well over 1 million viewers every night. Now, that doesn't sound like much, but it's a captive and engaged audience, more likely to vote, more likely to be politically active, and more likely to be enraged. Captive audiences are the holy grail for advertisers. They're loyal viewers with permanent eyeballs on your products. So your job as a news provider is to keep feeding these people what they want: more red meat.
In fact, over the past weeks, we've seen plenty of examples of the kind of courage, kindness, and selflessness that we're going to need to get through one of the most difficult times in our history.
Boy, oh boy, that's leadership. That's compassion. It's too bad that President Trump can't show either. By the way, what is it about President Obama that really gets under your skin? Is it because he's smarter than you? Better educated? Made it on his own? Didn't need daddy's help? His wife is more accomplished? Better looking? I don't know. What is it? What is it about him? That he's a black man that's accomplished, became president? That he punked you on the whole birth certificate thing? What is it about him? Just wondering.
Speaker Pelosi now apparently telling senior Democrats she'd like to see Trump behind bars. Based on no actual crime, she wants a political opponent locked up in prison. That happens in banana republics. Coming up, you'll meet the mother. Her son, tonight, sitting in jail for taking a photo of a classified area on a submarine. Hillary Clinton is campaigning to be our next president. She should be the one in jail. Equal justice would mean Hillary goes to jail. Can Hillary go to jail? They put the fix it and rig what would have put any other American in jail with Hillary. By the way, when is Hillary going to be charged?
Now, these opinion hosts are why people switch on cable TV. The straight news bulletins are by the by. It's the opinion hosts who can mold and shape minds, with many millions of viewers every week. They make the money for the networks because their followers are loyal. Add to the mix the fact that TV news providers in America aren't under any legal obligation to be fair and impartial, and you've got gold. Broadcasters in the UK, however, are forced to be fair and impartial in their news coverage in order to hold a license. The rules come under Section 5 of the regulator Ofcom's codes covering due impartiality, accuracy, and opinions. Similar rules did exist in America, but were thrown out more than 30 years ago when Ronald Reagan was president, and attempts since to revive the legislation have always stalled on the altar of the First Amendment, the right to free speech. So in the US, you can say what you like within the law. Your opinion is protected, and you can use all your power and might to beam that opinion right across the land without giving any counter-arguments, without reporting the opposing point of view. Opinion can be dressed up as news.
As Americans burned to death, people like this swung into action immediately. They went on television with a partisan talking point. Climate change, they said, caused these fires. They didn't explain how exactly that happened. How did climate change do that? They didn't tell us, but they just kept saying it. In the hands of Democratic politicians, climate change is like systemic racism in the sky. You can't see it, but rest assured it's everywhere and it's deadly. And like systemic racism, it is your fault. The American middle class did it. They caused climate change. They ate too many hamburgers. They drove too many SUVs. They had too many children.
Well, there are many in America horrified by the opinion hosts on both the right and the left, whether it be Fox News or MSNBC. Yet a study last year showed that both channels were in the top 5 of the most trusted news brands for viewers, symbolizing the country's political polarization. It's clear many Americans want their views affirmed, not challenged. Yet James Murdoch in 2009 claimed an unregulated market, one that wasn't policed by an outside body, would mean, and I quote, trusting and empowering consumers. And this will lead to the media making a genuine contribution to a better informed society, one in which trust in people and their freedom to choose is central to the way we behave. But there is absolutely no reason why an independent regulator would materially damage the consumer. I mentioned the study conducted last year that showed Fox News and MSNBC are in the top 5 most trusted news brands for American viewers. Well, the number 3 brand is PBS, the Public Broadcasting Service, whose nightly NewsHour News and Current Affairs show was deemed in the study by the University of California a few years ago to be the most centrist news program on television and the closest news show to holding a truly objective stance. That's because it has to be fair and balanced, as PBS is technically not a network, but a program distributor that provides television content and related services to its member stations across America, blue states and red states. But what's the brand that beats them all? Fox News, PBS, Bloomberg, and MSNBC when it comes to public trust. Yeah, it's the heavily regulated British Broadcasting Corporation, the BBC, subject to independent rules on impartiality and accuracy, is the most trusted news brand in America. Now, I'm not here to tub thump for the BBC, honest, but the figures are revealing and clearly suggest an ambition to be impartial, watched over by independent regulation, does make a difference for the better in helping to increase levels of public trust. The BBC isn't perfect by any means. Trust levels are under pressure, especially after the terribly divisive Brexit campaign. Its system of funding is under scrutiny like never before, and the giant tech companies with seemingly bottomless pockets of cash are now big media players. Yet the news division of this ancient institution, which will be 100 years old next year, still commands levels of trust many other media organizations would die for. Research last year by the independent think tank, the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism at Oxford University, so it's not me saying this, suggests the BBC is the most popular source of news in the UK among both Conservative and Labour voters, and among Leave and Remain voters, even after Brexit. This research showed that while the BBC is slightly less trusted by people who identify with the political right than people in the centre and on the left, it is still as trusted on the right as major conservative newspapers. The UK may be more divided than at any time in recent memory, but public service broadcasting, properly regulated, that helps ensure people see more diverse news, reducing the gap between the most and the least politically engaged, is playing a crucial role in helping prevent all manner of issues being viewed through a partisan and political lens. Not to put too fine a point on it, in its own way, the BBC helps bind the country together. And that is America's fundamental problem that I witnessed firsthand during last year's presidential election, the trust deficit at the heart of American democracy. For the first time ever, Edelman's annual trust barometer shows fewer than half of all Americans have trust in traditional media. 56% of Americans believe journalists and reporters lie, and 58% believe most news organizations are more concerned with supporting an ideology or political position rather than informing the public. A Gallup survey from last year showed a third of Americans had no trust at all that the media reports the news fully, accurately, and fairly. Almost another third said they had little trust and confidence in the media. Unregulated social media is at the very bottom of the pile when it comes to public trust. This is a state of affairs that has serious consequences for the fabric of US society and the future of American democracy.
If they don't fix this shit, we're gonna fucking take this country. Day? Millions of Americans are out
to protect the Constitution of the United States against enemies, foreign and domestic. Let's go, man. Go.
Watch out.
Fuck you, police!
The storming of the US Capitol building on January the 6th this year shamed America, but was partly the logical conclusion of a toxic media environment with no rules promoting public distrust. It was one consequence of a media free-for-all and was years in the making. And where there is a void of fact and truth and public trust, conspiracy theories can live and breed, even about a deadly virus in the middle of a pandemic.
That the US government, that the Biden administration doesn't want to really delve into the details of this is not just the work in the lab in Wuhan, which has been widely reported. Secretary Pompeo is exactly right. That is the most likely source of the leak from the lab that resulted in the pandemic. But the question is, who commissioned the work? Who started the work that they were doing in that lab? And the answer, as I was reporting this Sunday on my show, comes back right here to our country, to Dr. Fauci. Dr. Fauci is the leading world proponent of a type of virus research called gain of function. The idea is to manipulate genetic information in the lab to make viruses as contagious as possible so we can learn how to fight them. It's a noble intention, but accidents happen. In 2014, Dr. Fauci commissioned work that led to that kind of manipulation in the lab that is so close to what we saw with this pandemic. That's what needs to be investigated, and yet there's no one who wants to ask, why did Dr. Fauci commission that work and continue to fund it despite a ban in 2014 on that risky research being imposed by the Obama administration? And then the second big question, Maria, are we still funding this kind of research and risking another pandemic?
There is no evidence supporting anything you just heard there. That conspiracy theory involving claims against President Biden's chief medical advisor, Anthony Fauci, is heavily tied to disinformation campaigns pushed by China and Russia. But in the UK, despite the public's overwhelming confidence in the BBC and other public service broadcasters like ITN and Channel 4 News, silo thinking, the need to have your opinions reinforced rather than challenged, is on the march. I travelled around the country during the 2019 election campaign, from County Durham to Southampton and Enniskillen to Pembrokeshire. And I came across people on the right who'd be very happy to get their news from a UK equivalent of Fox News, and some on the left who'd be very happy to watch a British equivalent of MSNBC. It's in this atmosphere that 2 new TV channels are coming on stream here. GB News, under the leadership of the brilliant Andrew Neil, and a new venture backed by Rupert Murdoch. The New York Times quotes Andrew Neil as saying British news broadcasting is pretty much a one-party state. They all come at the stories from various shades of left, he says. GB News would come from the centre, perhaps the centre-right, not the hard-right approach of Fox. GB News will offer diverse voices and stick to the facts, says Andrew. He is too good a journalist with a reputation to protect to want to be associated with a news channel that peddles conspiracy theories and propaganda. And in any case, Ofcom the regulator is watching. Impartiality rules and strong regulation are the bulwark against the disaster of the American media jungle being replicated here, with its attendant detrimental effects on democracy. But with the perception of impartiality often being in the eyes and ears of the beholder, one Conservative MP, Steve Baker, influential in the Brexit vote to leave the European Union, and frequently interviewed about his views on the subject, believes Ofcom itself needs reform.
And just finally, there are reports this morning that Paul Dacre, the former editor of the Daily Mail, a critic of the BBC, is Boris Johnson's top choice for the job of Ofcom chairman. Is that an appointment you'd welcome?
Of course it is, yes, I'd be delighted. And of course, I'd like to see Charles Moore go in as chairman of the BBC. I think this would be great news. And I think anyone suggesting we were somehow appointing our preferred people needs to look at the record of others who've been appointed to these roles and try to be a bit, again, more realistic about politics and policy and who should be appointed by governments.
Why would it be great news then?
Well, because they're Conservatives and they might actually start to look at the way the media functions and ensure there's some impartiality. I can assure you that from my point of view, time and again during interviews, I've felt that there was a consensus thought on the side of the broadcaster, which was not on the side of moderate mainstream conservatism. So I look forward to them perhaps being appointed and being a bit more conservative and pragmatic in what is reported.
I began this speech with thoughts on who, what, where, when, and why, the basic ingredients of our trade as journalists. And I suggested that from time to time, we needed to ask ourselves, why do we do what we do? When James Murdoch posed that question in 2009 as chairman of B-Sky B, he stressed the importance of a media company making money, untrammeled by regulation, that a better informed society would flow from the market. But now, more than a decade later, when asked the same question, he's come to a very different conclusion. He's now attacking the US media for the current toxic politics threatening American democracy, and said in an interview with the Financial Times that proprietors are as culpable as politicians who know the truth but choose instead to propagate lies. He was asked whether Fox News was partly to blame for the storming of the Capitol building, and he said media groups had amplified election disinformation, leaving a substantial portion of the public believing a falsehood. The damage is profound, he told the FT. He went on to say the sacking of the Capitol is proof positive that what we thought was dangerous is indeed very, very much so. Those outlets that propagate lies to their audience, he said, have unleashed insidious and uncontrollable forces that will be with us for years. Part of James Murdoch's Damascene conversion was the frustration he apparently felt at Fox News' peddling of climate change denialism in the face of the appalling Australian wildfires that charred millions of acres in 2019. Fox News anchors in America had picked up disinformation stories claiming arson was the cause of the fires. These were written up in one of Rupert Murdoch's own newspapers, The Australian, and the Fox US anchors rebroadcast the disinformation. Now, I was in Australia at the time covering the fires, and the suggestion that arson was the main cause was laughable. Factcheck.org, after analysing all the available data, has concluded the vast majority of the fires were caused naturally. Sir Harold Evans would probably never have thought there would be a day when a senior member of the Murdoch family would actually agree with him, not just about the purpose of the media, but how it should be achieved. That there might actually be a point to independent regulators, because a clear and transparent set of rules and guidelines that everyone can follow and everyone can see increases public trust. The facts are plain. Public confidence in an unregulated media falls well below the level of confidence of a media that's regulated. I'll leave you with the words contained within the Fairness Doctrine, now consigned to history in America, but alive and well in the regulations of Ofcom. Their words Sir Harold Evans, I suspect, would echo. Licensees must not use their stations for the private interest, whims, or caprices of licensees, but in a manner which will serve the community generally as a whole. Broadcasters must provide adequate coverage of public issues and ensure that coverage fairly represents opposing views. The maintenance of democracy and a just and fair society. That is why I think we do what we do. Thank you.
Clive, bravo. I wish there was a huge audience standing on their feet and clapping you for that. It was passionate, it was provocative, it was flying the flag for old-fashioned standards. That's a novelty these days. But of course, I have got a few questions. I think you're a bit hard on James Murdoch, to be honest. The old James Murdoch, the for-profit James Murdoch. It's very easy for someone who's benefited from the privilege of the license fee, like you and me, to be a bit snooty about profit. But if you're a newspaper man in a commercial news organisation, without it, you go bust. And that's happened across the states in local papers. And our local papers are under a huge amount of pressure. When you were in the States, was there any model where you saw, as it were, commercial profit and quality news burgeoning, thriving?
Yeah, I think so. But just to sort of go back a little bit, I mean, I think chasing audiences for the BBC is the equivalent, despite the license fee, of chasing cash for a commercial enterprise. In fact, it's that very model that might require a kind of race to the bottom in programming in order to justify the actual levy of the license fee itself. So the pressures, I think, are as great on the BBC as they are on commercial enterprises. But I'd suggest a classic example of a media company that is doing well, walking that fine line on impartiality and fairness, is the New York Times. I mean, 7 million digital subscribers, apparently, bringing in more cash now than the print side of the business. It's sitting on a cash pile of $800 million. The key is public trust. If mistakes are made, then they're rectified and corrections are put in the paper. There's public confidence there. Republicans and Democrats are all over the op-ed pages of that paper. And the news is fair and balanced. That is a model, I think, that increases public trust. And if you increase public trust, you create an environment in which more people will want to buy your product. So it makes perfect sense to me.
But subscription, by definition, is exclusive. So it doesn't really underpin a democracy, does it? Where free and fair information is necessary for everyone.
Yes, but if you widen the base and widen the appeal that you have to people on the left and the right, people who believe in one thing and other people who believe in another, surely you've got a bigger market to aim for. I mean, it strikes me as logical. I mean, you can focus on a small market that is, passionate and wants your product. But you're going to be easily buffeted by political wins, by social wins that might change the makeup of that tiny audience. Broaden the base. That makes perfect sense, I would have thought, to a commercial broadcaster as well as the BBC.
You're pretty critical of opinion hosts, although you absolutely see why they are so charismatic, why they are so powerful for people who believe in them. You could argue one of our own cut price opinion hosts, Piers Morgan, has kind of taken a role that reflects a lot of opinion hosts in a modified way. Is that really impartial? Was what he was doing on Good Morning Britain impartial before his dramatic exit?
That's not for me to judge. All I will say is that the Duchess of Sussex put in a formal complaint to the regulator because the regulator was there. There was a method and a system that she could follow. But it wasn't just her. It was 41,000 other people complaining about what this broadcaster said. Now, look, there are lots of people who will say, well, he's been pushing the boundaries for ages. He has. He's been flexing those guardrails when it comes to fairness and impartiality. But the guardrails ultimately are there. They can flex, but they never broke. And the idea is that he tried to smash through it, some would argue, as a result of what he said concerning that interview with the Sussexes. But the guardrails held firm. Ofcom is looking at what he said, and it could be argued that it's the fact that so many people complained because they had a procedure and process in place. They had due process, I suppose you could say, that perhaps forced the hand of his employers or indeed forced his own hand.
You had a great clip from Steve Baker talking about Ofcom, and he's not the only one who's raising a big question about the very necessity for regulation in this country, something that's been very important to our media ecosystem. Lord Grade, former chairman of the BBC, former executive chairman of ITV, has said that it's an anachronism to have this kind of regulation. What's your view on that?
Yeah, I mean, systems and rules, they have to be fit for purpose, whichever age they're existing in, I suppose. But we live in an age of social media, for instance, that's unregulated. And in America is how most people actually get their news. And yet it's at the bottom of the pile for public trust. The type of media I would suggest to Lord Grade might have changed. But the fact that we've had a digital revolution that makes it easier to influence minds, to send propaganda and conspiracy theories right around the world, that reinforces the need for proper checks and balances, than negates the need for it. That seems logical to me, and I would put forward as Exhibit A, and James Murdoch would do the same, January the 6th this year, and the storming of the Capitol building. That's why you need checks and balances in this current media age.
And if Paul Dacre, an incredibly powerful, professional, extraordinarily successful newspaperman, does become chair of Ofcom, how do you think that will change their role?
Look, Ofcom's power doesn't come from a single man. It comes from the law, it comes from the courts, it comes from statutes, ultimately it comes from Parliament. I mean, I don't know how you skirt all that, whether you're the most left-wing chairman in the world or the most right-wing chairman in the world. It could be that if it is Paul Dacre, he decides that he's going to set a tone, for instance, in his annual reports. A looser tone, perhaps, when it comes to regulation and oversight of the broadcast media. But Ofcom's rules are, they'd stretch from here to France, as James Murdoch indicated in his McTaggart lecture. I mean, it's piles and piles and piles of regulations. I don't know how one person can influence all that and change all that. And ultimately, it wouldn't be Paul Dacre who makes any kind of adjudication or ruling on an individual matter. If Piers Morgan's prevails appeared before him, he wouldn't be making that decision. And at the end of the day, Ofcom is there to prevent people from being exposed to harmful or offensive material, unfair treatment, and invasion of privacy. And that's the crucial point. It's not up to one person to decide whether or not those rules have been broken. It is a whole.
You're quite an idealist about Ofcom. Some people say it's already losing its edge. I mean, look at LBC, great station, but it's got Nick Ferrari in the morning, very much right of centre. It's got James O'Brien with a smaller audience, very much left of centre. That's not a BBC idea of impartiality at all. How do you view it?
Again, the facts are that LBC has fallen foul of Ofcom's rules, and it has tried to skirt, it has tried to smash through those guardrails, and Ofcom has flexed its muscles. Again, as I say, as Harold Evans suggested, in giving reasons why he didn't want statutory regulation. He wanted individual newspaper editors and an independent regulator to be able to sort of look through the cracks and be a little bit more flexible. And Ofcom's rules can flex. You know, there's no question about that. And LBC has pushed the limits, but ultimately they know that they cannot go the whole hog. They cannot go the America way. They cannot have the equivalent of American shock jobs. And that, I think, has got to be good for all of us in any thriving democracy.
So does it not, in the end, come down to us, the audience? Are we not to be trusted to make our own individual media choices without the nanny state interfering?
Look, I mean, you know, we put on seatbelts when we get into cars. You know, there are regulations that govern all our lives. You know, we're all living in lockdown at the moment. You know, sometimes you've got to look at the wider good for society and balance individual freedoms against the collective good. And I think on balance, you know, we have that here in the United Kingdom in a way that we don't have in America. And again, I would point to the divisiveness of last year's election campaign and potentially compare that to what happened during the Brexit campaign. You know, I mean, a high level of acrimony and division in this country, but nowhere near the kind of separation of two ideas, two views on how we should live as a country. Nowhere near the kind of division that we saw in America. And I think that has a lot to do with our media laws. And that's why I think Ofcom has a long road to travel in protecting this country. And is a good part of why we don't have the kind of division that we have, that we can see in America.
And how do you think Harold Evans would view all this? Wise man that he was. I wish we'd all met him.
Yeah, I wish I'd met him as well, actually. I mean, you know, far be it from me to try to sort of divine what a man such as he would be thinking. But I suspect he'd keep it really simple. And he'd say, look, if you haven't got public trust, what's the point? And that's what's eroded in America. And it's what hasn't so far been completely eroded here. If you haven't got public trust, what's the point?
Clive, thank you very, very much, both for the lecture and for your honesty in answering those questions. We're delighted to offer this programme to you without charge, but if you can, please give generously to the journalist charity. The details are on your screen. And thank you very much for joining us.